Orlando, Florida, October 21st, 2001. The city hummed with its usual energy. Tourists spilling out of theme parks, college students filling late-night diners, the skyline glowing against the warm autumn night. But inside a quiet apartment near the University of Central Florida, a young woman's world was about to end in a storm of violence that no one saw coming. Her name was Christine Franke, 25 years old, a psychology major, a dreamer with a grounded spirit, working her way through school while piecing together the kind of future every parent wants for their child. Friends described her as magnetic. She carried herself with warmth, with laughter that made people stop and listen. But that night, Christine would never make it to tomorrow. A single gunshot cut through the silence of her apartment. When police arrived, they found her lifeless body, murdered during what looked like a robbery. The scene was raw, confusing, and cruel. There were no witnesses, no forced entry, no immediate suspect. Just grief, shock, and evidence bagged up with the hope it might someday speak. For Christine's mother, Mary, the phone call that night was the kind every parent dreads. Her daughter, the girl she had raised, the girl who had dreams of walking across a graduation stage, of starting a life of her own, was gone. Murdered in her own home. The brutality didn't just steal Christine's life. It tore a hole through her family's world. Detectives launched a full-scale investigation. They pulled fingerprints. They swabbed for DNA. They interviewed anyone who might have crossed Christine's path. But the trail went cold almost as soon as it began. And so the waiting started. Weeks became months. Months became years. Birthdays and holidays passed with an empty chair at the table. Mary kept Christine's memory alive, but she also lived with the unbearable weight of questions that never found answers. Who had killed her daughter, and why? For 17 years, the case remained a ghost story inside the Orlando Police Department, a file collecting dust, a name that never faded but never found justice. Until 2018. Science had caught up to the darkness. Investigators pulled Christine's case back into the light, armed with a new weapon, genetic genealogy. By uploading DNA from the crime scene into public databases, they could build a family tree of the killer, track him through bloodlines, even if he had never been arrested. What happened next cracked open the silence that had gripped Christine's family for nearly 2 decades. The DNA didn't just whisper a clue, it shouted a name. Benjamin Holmes, a man Christine never knew, a man hiding in plain sight, a man who thought he had gotten away with murder. But DNA never forgets. This is the story of Christine Franke, a young woman's bright future cut short, a family's desperate fight for justice, and the groundbreaking science that finally unmasked the killer. The life of Christine Franke began like so many others, an ordinary childhood in Florida, surrounded by family, nurtured by dreams. She wasn't born into privilege or fame. She was a young woman who carved her path with determination and quiet strength. By 2001, she was 25 years old, a psychology student at the University of Central Florida. Christine was the type of person who left an impression on everyone she met. Friends described her as loyal, compassionate, and full of energy. She had a way of listening that made people feel heard, as if their stories mattered to her as much as her own. She worked while going to school, balancing classes and shifts to support herself. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and Christine was committed to making her future happen. She dreamed of one day helping people, perhaps through counseling, perhaps in research. Psychology for her wasn't just a degree, it was a calling. She was drawn to understanding human behavior, to making sense of the struggles people carried inside. And in a cruel twist of fate, it would be human behavior at its darkest: violence, greed, selfishness. that would end her story before it truly began. October 21st, 2001, was an unremarkable Sunday in Orlando. The air carried the kind of heavy warmth that lingers in Florida well into autumn. Christine spent the day much like any other, studying, making plans with friends, moving through the rhythms of student life. She lived in a modest apartment complex not far from UCF's campus. It was the kind of place filled with young professionals, students, and working families. Safe, ordinary, a backdrop where nothing truly sinister was expected to happen. But evil rarely announces itself. Somewhere in the evening hours, Christine returned to her apartment. Whether she sensed she was being watched, whether she noticed anything out of place, those details remain locked in silence. What is known is that in the hours that followed, she came face to face with someone who saw her not as a human being, but as an opportunity. A robbery. That's what detectives would later call it. A crime driven not by personal hatred, but by desperation or perhaps arrogance. But labels hardly matter when the outcome is the same. Inside her apartment, Christine encountered the intruder. There are no witnesses to describe the exact exchange. No neighbors recalled hearing shouting. No screams pierced the air. What happened in those minutes remains one of the most terrifying realities of homicide. Sometimes death comes quickly and quietly. A gun was drawn. Christine, unarmed and vulnerable, was trapped in her own home. There was no escape, no second chance. A single gunshot echoed inside the apartment, a bullet that ended a life full of promise. Christine collapsed, her future erased in an instant. The killer left behind a ransacked space, evidence scattered like puzzle pieces. But he also left behind something far more permanent than he realized: his DNA. The silence of Christine's apartment stretched into the next day. Friends began to worry when they couldn't reach her. Calls went unanswered. Messages sat unopened. Finally, someone came to check. What they found was devastating. Christine Franke, daughter, student friend, was lying lifeless inside her apartment, killed by a gunshot wound to the head. The news spread quickly. Police arrived, securing the scene, documenting every detail. Forensic teams worked methodically, collecting fingerprints, fibers, and crucially, biological evidence. Among the items logged and sealed were traces of DNA that investigators hoped would identify the killer. But DNA in 2001 was not what it is today. The technology existed, but the databases were limited. The resources stretched thin. A match would only be possible if the suspect was already in the system. And when Christine's evidence was processed, there was no hit. The killer had no record. He was invisible. Orlando police detectives launched an exhaustive investigation. They interviewed neighbors, classmates, co-workers, anyone who might have known Christine or noticed unusual activity around the time of her murder. They looked into her relationships, her routines, her habits. Nothing pointed to a clear suspect. There were no signs of forced entry, raising the chilling possibility that Christine may have opened the door herself, perhaps to someone she thought she could trust, or perhaps the intruder slipped in unnoticed, taking advantage of a moment's vulnerability. Detectives considered every angle. Was this personal? A jealous ex? A stranger? A random act of violence? Each theory unraveled into dead ends. The DNA profile remained their strongest lead, but without a match, it was a fingerprint without a name. For Christine's family, especially her mother Mary, the days after the murder were a blur of disbelief and agony. How do you process the fact that your daughter was alive one day and brutally murdered the next? How do you sit in her room, surrounded by her belongings, knowing she will never walk through the door again? Mary became a voice for her daughter in the years that followed. She demanded updates, pressed investigators for answers, refused to let Christine's name fade into the background. But grief is relentless. It was not just the absence of Christine that tore at the family, but the lack of justice. To lose a child is unbearable. To lose a child without knowing who was responsible is a torment beyond words. Orlando is a city that thrives on light, theme parks, family vacations, and constant entertainment. But Christine Franke's murder cast a long shadow. It became one of those cases whispered about in the community, a reminder that even in a city built on sunshine and fantasy, darkness was never far away. Her apartment complex changed tenants. Students came and went. Life moved forward for the city, but for Christine's loved ones, time froze on October 21st. As the investigation dragged on, Christine's case joined the ranks of cold cases, files that detectives revisit when time allows, hoping new evidence or new technology can offer a breakthrough. For the Franke family, it meant birthdays and holidays without her. It meant watching Christine's peers graduate, marry, start families, while she remained forever 25. But the DNA evidence, sealed in those crime scene envelopes, waited patiently. Science was advancing. Technology was evolving. And though the killer may have thought he had escaped, the truth was quietly closing in. To understand the weight of silence that followed Christine Franke's murder, you first have to understand who she was to the people who loved her. Christine wasn't just another college student in Orlando. She was someone who could light up a room simply by being in it. Friends remember her laugh, full, unfiltered, the kind that pulled you in and made you feel part of something warm. She was quick to lend a hand, to offer a late-night pep talk before exams, to show up when others didn't. In her psychology classes at the University of Central Florida, professors noted her focus. She was one of those students who didn't just memorize material, she questioned it. She wanted to understand people, the forces that shaped them, the traumas they carried. That curiosity gave her a sensitivity others felt immediately. Christine wasn't studying psychology to collect a degree. She wanted to heal people, to give them a chance at the life they deserved. Her mother, Mary, often said Christine was her best friend. They shared everything, stories, hopes, frustrations. Mary had raised her daughter to be independent, but also to know she could always come home. Christine had dreams, yes, but she also had roots. She loved music. She loved dancing. She loved the Florida sun and the late-night energy of Orlando. She had friends who saw her as the glue of their group, the one who always made sure no one was left out. This was Christine's life in 2001, a vibrant 25-year-old with classes, friends, and family pulling her in every direction, but all of it shaping a future she couldn't wait to embrace. And that is exactly why her absence became unbearable, because she was not the kind of person who disappeared quietly. When Christine was found murdered in her apartment, Orlando police threw every available resource into the investigation. Homicide detectives canvassed her neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking questions, piecing together her last known movements. Her friends and family were interviewed repeatedly. Had she mentioned anyone new? Had she seemed worried? Was there anyone who might want to hurt her? The questions cut deep because the answers were always the same. Christine didn't have enemies. She didn't live recklessly. She wasn't the type to attract danger. The DNA collected from the crime scene became the focal point of the case. Detectives knew they had something powerful, a biological fingerprint left by the killer. But in 2001, that fingerprint had meaning only if it matched an existing profile in CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. When the results came back with no match, investigators hit their first wall. Whoever killed Christine wasn't in the system. He had no prior convictions for violent crime, no arrests that required him to give a DNA sample. He was a ghost. Over the months that followed, detectives pursued dozens of leads. They looked at Christine's relationships, past boyfriends, and co-workers. They examined the possibility of a burglary gone wrong, given that items were missing from her apartment. But each avenue ended the same way, with no evidence pointing to a specific person. The DNA was their key, but without a name, it unlocked nothing. The Franke family, meanwhile, lived in limbo. Christine's murder dominated every thought, every conversation. Mary Franke became relentless in her pursuit of answers, calling detectives, attending meetings, pushing for progress. But progress was slow. The media covered the case sporadically. In the early days, it was front-page news. As months turned into years, the headlines shifted to other stories. Christine's murder slipped from public attention, but for her family, it never left the room. By 2003, Christine's case was considered cold. Detectives still cared, still pulled the file, still checked for updates. But without new evidence or a DNA match, there was little they could do. Technology marched forward. DNA analysis improved, but the databases remained limited. In the early 2000s, genealogical DNA wasn't yet an option. The idea that you could trace a killer through distant relatives uploading their DNA for family history projects sounded like science fiction. So Christine's file sat, waiting. Detectives rotated in and out of the homicide unit. Some retired, some moved to other divisions. New investigators inherited her case, flipping through reports, walking the same paths their predecessors had walked, reaching the same frustrating conclusions. By the late 2000s, 7-8 years had passed without answers. Mary Franke often spoke about the strange limbo of living with a cold case. "You're not just grieving," she once said. "You're waiting. You're waiting for a phone call that could come any day, or never at all." That waiting seeped into every corner of her life. Friends of Christine drifted apart, as young adults often do, but they carried the weight of her absence with them. Some pursued careers, others started families, but Christine remained frozen in 2001, forever 25. Orlando itself had changed. The city grew, new neighborhoods emerged, and crime ebbed and flowed. But within the police department, Christine's file remained a constant reminder of unfinished business. Around 2010, forensic science was changing again. DNA analysis was becoming more sensitive, able to detect smaller degraded samples. Cold case units around the country began reopening files, hoping new technology could do what old methods could not. Christine's case was re-examined. The DNA evidence was still intact, still viable. Detectives hoped that as CODIS expanded, a match might finally appear. Every year, new profiles were added to the system. Every year, the odds inched slightly higher. But still, nothing. By 2018, Christine's case was 17 years old. An entire generation of students had cycled through the University of Central Florida since her murder. Neighbors who had once lived in her apartment complex were long gone. The city had changed, the world had changed, but the Franke family was still waiting. And then, just as hope had started to fade, technology caught up with justice. A new form of DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, would offer what 17 years of traditional policing could not. The ghost in Christine's apartment finally had a name. The years after Christine's murder did not pass quietly for Mary Franke. To the outside world, time seemed to dull the edges of tragedy. Neighbors eventually stopped bringing casseroles. Friends, well-meaning but ill-equipped, grew hesitant to mention Christine's name. The world kept spinning. Newscasts rolled on. Holidays came and went. Children grew into adults. But for Mary, the clock had stopped on October 21, 2001. Her daughter had been only 25 years old, still blossoming, still laughing at sitcoms, still buying second-hand paperbacks by the stack. And then, in a moment of violence so sudden and cruel, Christine's light had been extinguished. For Mary, grief was not a wound that scabbed over. It was a raw, unrelenting burn that refused to heal. But Mary was not the kind of woman to sit passively in sorrow. Every morning she poured 2 cups of coffee, one for herself, one for Christine. The second cup sat cooling at the kitchen table, untouched, a ritual that was both comfort and torment. Sometimes Mary whispered into the steam, "I'm still fighting, Christine. I won't stop until they find him." Family members urged her to let go. Friends suggested counseling. But Mary had found her mission. She would not allow her daughter's murder to fade into the archives of forgotten crimes. Christine deserved more than a dusty case file in a locked drawer. For years after the murder, detectives visited Mary with updates. At first, their words carried hope. "We're running DNA tests. We're following leads." But soon the updates grew sparse, then mechanical, then apologetic. By 2005, when Christine would have been 29, the detectives' visits had dwindled to an occasional phone call. Mary despised the silence. She kept a notebook by her bed, scribbling down the names of detectives, the dates of phone calls, even rumors she overheard from neighbors or read on message boards. She became her own archivist of justice, documenting everything. When weeks stretched into months with no word from investigators, Mary picked up the phone herself. "This is Christine Franke's mother," she would say, her voice firm, unwavering. "Do you have anything new for me?" The answer was always the same: no, nothing new. But Mary's persistence wore at them. Detectives knew her name. Prosecutors recognized her voice. Reporters remembered her face. If Christine's case was not progressing, it was not because her mother was silent. In 2006, 5 years after Christine's death, Mary stood in front of local news cameras with a photograph of her daughter pressed against her chest. "She was my only child," she told the reporters, her voice cracking. "I will not stop asking until the person who did this is caught." Television stations replayed the clip that evening. Strangers sent letters of sympathy, some even offering tips, most of them wild, unverifiable, and ultimately useless. Still, Mary welcomed each call and email, each envelope slid under her door. Even when the information led nowhere, she clung to the idea that people remembered Christine's name. Over the years, she appeared on anniversaries of the crime, speaking into microphones, her grief still sharp. Some producers stopped calling, believing her story was no longer newsworthy. But Mary refused to retreat. She became the story, the grieving mother who would not stop speaking her daughter's name. Friends sometimes asked why she never moved away from Orlando, why she hadn't remarried, or traveled, or attempted to restart her life. Mary would answer softly, "How could I? Christine is here. She's in that apartment. She's in this city. Until her killer is caught, I can't leave her behind." Her home became a shrine of sorts. Christine's clothes hung neatly in her closet, her college papers stacked on a shelf, her perfume bottle still lined on the dresser, faintly holding the scent of her daughter. Visitors sometimes whispered that Mary was trapped, but she knew better. It wasn't that she couldn't move on, it was that she refused to. There were dark moments, nights when Mary collapsed on the living room floor, clutching Christine's framed graduation photo, sobbing until she couldn't breathe. Days when she wondered if justice would ever come, or if her daughter's case would die a cold, bureaucratic death in some forgotten filing cabinet. She attended grief groups, but the stories of car accidents, illnesses, or natural causes left her restless. "But someone chose to do this to my Christine," she would whisper, her voice bitter. Anger became her companion. Not a blind rage, but a smoldering fire that pushed her forward. By 2010, nearly a decade after the murder, Mary began writing letters. Some went to lawmakers urging more funding for DNA testing, others to police chiefs, begging them not to let Christine's case go cold. A few went to newspapers, small op-eds about violence, memory, and justice. She didn't always receive replies. But when envelopes arrived with official seals, Mary opened them with trembling hands. Even a form letter was proof her voice had been heard. In 2014, when the first stories of genealogy databases being used to solve cold cases began trickling into the news, Mary read every article she could find. She clipped stories, highlighted names, circled phrases like familial DNA. She began calling detectives again, urging them to consider it for Christine. The detectives listened politely, but progress was slow. Still, Mary had found her new weapon, science. She believed, with a conviction bordering on obsession, that DNA would someday give Christine her justice. 17 years passed this way. Birthdays marked by silent candles, Christmases with one less stocking on the mantle, anniversaries of Christine's death observed not with flowers but with pleas to reporters, please just tell her story again. Mary had become both mother and warrior, grief-stricken and relentless, carrying Christine's memory through a world that often wanted her to forget. And then, one ordinary afternoon in 2018, the phone finally rang with something different. Detectives wanted to see her. They had news. Mary's breath caught. For 17 years she had waited for this moment. The dam was breaking. 17 years is an eternity when you are waiting for justice. For Mary Franke, the days after Christine's murder had bled into years that seemed endless, each one stamped by anniversaries, unanswered questions, and the gnawing silence of a case gone cold. But beneath that silence, beneath the paperwork and forgotten boxes in the evidence room, something had been waiting all along. A sliver of Christine's killer's DNA. It was the only voice that had never gone quiet. Detective Michael Fields, named representative for the Orlando PD detectives who worked the case, had inherited Christine's file years earlier. He was not the first investigator on it, nor the second, but Christine's murder stuck with him. She was young, promising, full of life. The brutality of her death was senseless, and each time he flipped through the thick folder, he found himself unsettled. The case wasn't unsolvable. It was just waiting for the right tool. In the evidence room, the swabs from Christine's apartment had been preserved, sealed in sterile tubes. The DNA profile extracted years earlier had been uploaded into CODIS, the national database of known offenders, but it had never matched. The killer had no criminal record that tied him into the system. But now, with the rise of genealogy databases, a new door had cracked open. When Mary called again in early 2018, pressing once more for answers, Detective Fields finally said the word she had been aching to hear. "We're trying something new. Just hold on a little longer." For Mary, those words were fragile hope. She had been told before to hold on, but this time something in the detective's tone felt different. In the spring of 2018, the Orlando Police Department worked with forensic genealogists to upload the unknown DNA profile from Christine's murder scene into GED Match, a public genealogy database where users voluntarily shared their DNA results to find family connections. The system hummed, searching across thousands of profiles, looking for branches of a family tree that would eventually point back to one man. At first, the matches were distant, third cousins, fourth cousins. But genealogists are puzzle solvers by nature. With every match, they began building sprawling family trees, tracing generations back, then forward again. eliminating branches, narrowing down possibilities. Piece by piece, the tree closed in. By late summer, the genealogists and detectives had a name: Benjamin Holmes. Holmes was not a stranger in Orlando. He lived less than a mile from Christine at the time of her murder. He had walked the same streets, shopped at the same stores. Yet somehow, for 17 years, he had remained invisible, a shadow who blended into the ordinary. Detectives ran background checks. Holmes had a history of minor arrests, but nothing that had ever landed his DNA in CODIS. That explained why he had slipped through the cracks. Now, with genealogy as their compass, investigators believed they had found their man. But belief wasn't enough. They needed proof. Surveillance began quietly. Detectives followed Holmes, watching his routines, waiting for him to discard something they could legally collect. Something that might carry his DNA. Weeks of patience paid off one afternoon when Holmes tossed a used coffee cup into a public trash can. Gloved hands retrieved it. Forensic scientists swabbed the rim. The profile was tested. When the results came back, they landed like thunder. The DNA from the cup matched the DNA from Christine Franke's apartment. The killer had been unmasked. On September 2018, 17 years after Christine's death, detectives knocked on Holmes's door. The man who had walked free all these years was now in handcuffs, bewildered, the weight of nearly 2 decades crashing down in a single instant. For the detectives, it was triumph wrapped in solemnity. They had solved the case, but solving it did not erase the years of loss. For Mary, when the call came, it was something she had both prayed for and dreaded. She sat at her kitchen table when the detectives told her the news, the same table where Christine's second cup of coffee still sometimes sat cooling. "We've arrested someone for Christine's murder. His name is Benjamin Holmes. It was DNA. We're sure." Mary's breath caught. For a moment she said nothing. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. Then finally she whispered, 17 years? Her voice cracked, tears spilling down her face. 17 years I've been waiting for this call, but alongside the relief, there was a sharp pang of sorrow. Justice, yes, but no amount of justice could bring Christine back. Holmes's arrest was not a victory in the traditional sense. It was a closing of one wound, leaving a scar that would never fade. News of the arrest made headlines across Florida and beyond. Local stations replayed footage of Christine's smiling face from her college days, her laughter frozen in photographs. Reporters spoke of genealogy as the new frontier of crime solving, of how science had given voice to the voiceless. For Mary, the cameras returned once more, pointed at her tear-streaked face as she spoke into microphones. "This doesn't bring my daughter back, but I can finally say her killer's name, and I can finally begin to let go of this part of the fight." Benjamin Holmes, 38 at the time of his arrest, was charged with Christine's murder. Court proceedings stretched on as they always do, but the foundation of the case was undeniable. The DNA that had lingered silently for nearly 2 decades had spoken, and it spoke his name. In that courtroom, Christine's presence was everywhere, her photo displayed for jurors, her name invoked again and again. For Mary, sitting in the gallery, it was both excruciating and necessary. The breakthrough in Christine Franke's case was more than a personal victory. It became part of a broader story about the power of forensic genealogy. Christine's name joined the growing list of victims whose killers had finally been unmasked not by eyewitnesses or confessions, but by science and persistence. For Mary, it was the end of one chapter of her vigil, but not the end of her mission. She continued to advocate for the use of DNA technology in other cold cases, hoping other families would not have to wait 17 years for justice. Because justice delayed is justice scarred. But in Christine's case, at last, it had arrived. In the long history of unsolved murders in America, Christine Franke's case stands as both a tragedy and a turning point. For 17 years, her name drifted in and out of the public eye, a reminder of a crime without a face, a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved. Families across the country knew that feeling all too well. The birthdays passed in silence, the unopened Christmas stockings, the sense that justice had slipped through time's fingers. But Christine's case didn't just end with an arrest. It became part of a much larger story, a story about how science is rewriting what cold really means. When Christine was murdered in 2001, the gold standard of investigation was fingerprint dusting, eyewitness accounts, and CODIS, the FBI's database of known offenders. If the suspect wasn't in the system, detectives were left with little but hunches and heartbreak. That was Christine's reality. The DNA found in her apartment was preserved, tested, and uploaded, but it matched no one. For years, the evidence sat like a locked box without a key. Then came the revolution of genetic genealogy. What had once been a tool for adoptees and family historians suddenly became a weapon for law enforcement. By cross-referencing crime scene DNA with profiles uploaded to public databases, investigators could identify relatives of an unknown suspect. From there, genealogists built family trees, narrowed suspects, and, in case after case, finally gave names to ghosts. Christine's case was one of those victories, and her killer, Benjamin Holmes, was revealed not through confession or coincidence, but through the undeniable mathematics of bloodlines. The arrest in Christine's case came just months after the Golden State Killer was unmasked through the same technique. Suddenly, what seemed like a miracle was becoming a movement. In the years that followed, hundreds of cold cases across the U.S. were cracked wide open, Jane Does were identified, long-forgotten murderers were pulled into courtrooms, families who had lived in the shadows of grief for decades received long-awaited phone calls. For Mary Franke, Christine's mother, the science that caught Holmes wasn't abstract, it was deeply personal. "This doesn't bring Christine back," she told reporters after Holmes's arrest. "But at least I can stop asking who. At least I know." Her words echoed the feelings of countless other families. DNA doesn't heal the wound, but it closes the question, and for many, that closure is the first step toward peace. Christine's story also touched off a debate that still continues today. How far should law enforcement go in using public genealogy databases? Critics worry about privacy, about whether people truly consent when their DNA is uploaded into systems like GED Match. Supporters argue that the power to catch murderers, rapists, and predators outweighs those concerns. In Christine's case, the answer felt simple to those who loved her. Without this tool, Holmes would likely have lived out his life as a free man, his crime buried under time. For Mary, that was unthinkable. Every victim has a story. Every case leaves behind a ripple. Christine's life was more than the way she died. She was a daughter, a student, a dreamer whose laughter once filled a college apartment. But her death and the long path to justice became part of something greater, the proof that no case is truly beyond reach. When detectives closed Christine's file in 2018, they didn't just solve a murder, they offered hope. Hope to families in Orlando with other unsolved cases. Hope to families across the United States whose loved ones' killers still walk free. Hope that science, persistence, and human determination can bend time back toward justice. Today, Christine Franke's name is spoken in the same breath as other cases that genetic genealogy has helped solve. She is part of a growing legacy of victims whose voices were amplified not by new witnesses or sudden confessions, but by the silent testimony of DNA. For Mary, that legacy is bittersweet. She continues to speak Christine's name, not only to honor her daughter's memory, but to remind others that justice, even delayed, is possible. 17 years of waiting ended with a coffee cup tossed in the trash, a chain of data points on a genealogy chart, and the determination of detectives who refused to let her story fade. And in that, Christine Franke lives on, not just in the hearts of those who knew her, but in the ever-growing promise that no case is ever truly cold. Christine Franke's story is more than a case file. It is the story of a daughter, a student, a dreamer whose life was stolen, but whose memory continues to push the boundaries of justice forward. Her name reminds us that behind every cold case is a family waiting, a mother grieving, a community forever changed. Christine deserves to be remembered not for the violence that ended her life, but for the warmth she carried, the dreams she nurtured, and the laughter she shared. If her story moved you, let it move you to act. Speak her name, share her story. And remember, justice delayed is not justice denied, as long as we refuse to let silence win. And here's how you can help. Leave a comment below with Christine's name so her memory lives on. Share this video so others know her story. Subscribe to Vanished Voices, because every time you do, you keep alive the promise that no victim is forgotten, and no case is too cold for justice. Christine Franke still has a voice. Through us, through you, it will never fade. Because justice begins when silence ends.